I'm going to call to order the special meeting for the Vacaville City Council, March 2nd, 2021. Can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Stockton.
Here.
Councilmember Silva.
Here.
Councilmember Roberts.
Here.
Councilmember Wiley.
Here.
Vice Mayor Sullivan.
Here.
Mayor Roulette.
I'm present. We will move to item 2, a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. If you can please rise with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, we're going to move to item 3, public comment. I will give everyone 3 minutes tonight on the phone. And I just want to remind the public that public comment, because this is a special called meeting, is limited to only business listed items from this agenda. So if you are talking about something else not on this agenda tonight, I will ask you to get back on topic, or we will cut you off and go to the next caller. Crystal, do we have any callers tonight?
Alicia Minion, I'll open your mic.
Hi. Hopefully you can hear me. I want to thank the staff and the council for this meeting tonight, that it's dedicated to such an important issue. As you know, the pension, the CalPERS pension that's offered to the employees, and then there's a second pension offered to the miscellaneous employees called PARS. And then we have the third liability, which is OPEB, which is the retirement health care that's provided to employees, their spouses, children to the age of 26, including supplemental Medicare or Medigap that's offered to the employees and their spouses after the age of 65 until their death. This liability, according to the staff report, is reported at around $327 million. And it reminded me of a meeting that the council had back in March of 2015. And at that time, there was a meeting also to discuss a similar topic. And at that time, the total of those 3 liabilities was $266 million. In the meantime, since 2015 until now, I recognize that, there's been some steps made by employees to make contributions, for example, to the OPEB trust, which is around $50 or $100. And also, I recognize the city has made great strides in funding the OPEB trust. And I think it was reported at over $56 million. I think that because despite these efforts that these liabilities have increased, that I really want to encourage that a third-party expert be hired to address these liabilities, and also to really adopt and establish those recommendations made by the OPEB Advisory Committee. And in the end, this isn't really to, criticize the employees, or this isn't really a negative thing. It's really important that we find a way to manage these liabilities, because as you know, the city is in the business of providing services, and this type of liability in the long term, it puts the residents at risk that we won't realize all the services that we are promised or needed. So there's this term in the industry called crowding out services, and that's really what I'm worried about tonight. And I hope you take the opportunity to really, really consider the third party, and really, actually, you could really kind of suspend your funding of the OPEB until you hire a third party. I've talked about this before. You're prioritizing the OPEB liability over the pension, and your pensions, like for safety, is 64.4% funded. You literally only have 64 cents for every dollar you need to pay on pension. And I think we just need to stop and hire the expert and really find a plan of action to really shore up the unfunded liability for your pensions, including that second.
Alicia, your 3 minutes are up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do we have the next caller?
Oh, the only other hand I see is also Alicia Minion. I see no other hands at this time.
I'm going to close public comment and we'll move to item 4. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the City Council. At your last City Council meeting, staff presented the Council with a proposed calendar of special study sessions in an effort to help our newly elected members to the City Council with some very important topics that they will be, the Council as a whole will be working with in the upcoming year and years ahead. So what we wanted to do is conduct several special study sessions for purposes of basically providing study sessions, if you will, on important topics. And tonight we begin that effort with the first one dealing with unfunded liability. And tonight we have our team of experts here, led by our Assistant City Manager, Don Leonardini, our Finance Director, Kim Atsamia, and our HR Director, Jessica Bose, who is going to start the presentation off for you tonight.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and Council. Tonight we're going to be presenting information to you regarding the city's current unfunded liabilities. Ken and I will be going back and forth throughout the presentation. Next slide, please, Crystal. A quick glance at our agenda for tonight. We want to cover the current unfunded amounts, some definitions, our current tiers, and then we'll break out into very detailed information on OPEB and then pension. Next slide, please. OPEB or other post-employment benefits. The city currently has two types of unfunded liabilities, one being OPEB or other post-employment benefits, the other being pension. Currently, the city's OPEB includes retiree health insurance. Some other types of OPEB can include long-term care and dental and vision insurance. The city's pension liability is with PERS and PARS, of which we will address in more detail later in the presentation. Next slide, Crystal, and I'm going to turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Jessica. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of the Council. We'll be going over these liabilities in more detail as we go through the presentation, but to start, the following slide shows the city's current unfunded liability as of the most recent actuarial valuation report, which was based off of data through June 30th of 2019. The pie chart on the left is for OPEB. The blue section represents our assets we had set aside as of that date, which totaled $38.4 million, leaving us with an unfunded liability of $78.2 million, which is shown in orange. On the pie chart on the right, that is for pension, and so it includes our pension plans with PERS and our supplemental plan with PARS. The total unfunded liability for our pension plans, which is shown in orange, is $249.5 million. Next slide, please. So similar to what we've done with the budget update presentations, we also wanted to find some of the most common terminology we use related to unfunded liabilities. So the first three terms are used when we measure our funding progress. And so the actuarial liability, that's the present value of promised benefits earned as of the valuation date. So our most recent one being June 30th of 2019. The assets are the value of assets set aside to fund obligations. So using OPEB as an example, this would be the amount of money that we have set aside in our trust. And then the unfunded actuarial liability is the difference between the actuarial liability and assets as of the valuation date. And then the next two terms are used when we discuss the annual amount that we need to fund each year. So there's the normal cost portion of that, which is the value of planned benefits that are earned during the year. And then there's the actuarially determined contribution. So that's the total sum of the normal cost. And then when we have an unfunded liability like we do, the amount that's to be amortized in that year is also part of that ADC amount that we pay. Next slide, please. So this slide right here kind of visually shows the relationship between those terms that went over in the last slide. So for the UAL, that number comes from taking the actuarial liability and then subtracting out the assets as of the date of the valuation. And then for the bottom part, that is for the annual amount that we need to fund each year. So there's two components to that. There's the normal cost, and then there's that year's portion of the UAL amortization payment. And when you add those two amounts together, that's when you get your ADC, which can also be thought of as our annual mortgage payment. And then next slide, please. I'll now pass it back to Jessica.
We currently have 3 tiers of OPEB and 3 tiers of pension. We'll be covering these in more detail as we move through the presentation, but wanted to show you side by side what those look like in an overall structure. Next slide, please. Now more in depth on OPEB. Next slide, please. In 1975, the city began providing health to active and retired employees. This health plan established 45 years ago, and after 34 years of paying 100% of the premium, the city asked the bargaining units to work together to reduce the city's costs and unfunded future liability of the plan. Over the past 12 plus years, the city council, city staff, and unions have worked together to make significant changes in the structure of this benefit. Some of the highlight of these changes include increases in employee and retiree contributions toward health, establishment of a trust, ongoing contributions to the trust by employees, and ultimately the recent establishment of Tier 3. While the council, staff, and labor were already working on Tier 3 and had completed those negotiations with all non-safety groups, simultaneously the Solano County Grand Jury issued a report to the city entitled Survival of OPEB, Other Post-Employment Benefits. The report acknowledges Tier 3 at the time, but it was when we only had it in place for non-safety groups. Ken's going to cover that grand jury report and go into more detail on the city's responses. Next slide, please.
Great, thanks, Jessica. So as Jessica mentioned in the following section of the presentation, we are going to go over the findings and recommendations made in the OPEB grand jury report, the responses that we provided, and any updates that have taken place since that report was issued. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to read these slides. These are going to be the findings and the recommendations that were listed in the grand jury report. So the first finding was that while the city of Vacaville made minor adjustments to the OPEB debt, with the most significant change affecting employees hired on or after December of 2018, the cost for current employees and retirees still represents a significant financial threat to the city, which has not been sufficiently addressed. The recommendation was that there was 1A, which is to identify potential solutions to lower OPEB costs through updated policies and labor relations strategies. And then the second part was to establish a citizen oversight committee charged with studying OPEB and proposing recommendations to the council. Next slide, please. So in the city's response, we stated the multiple steps taken by the employees and city since 2009 that Jessica discussed a little earlier, including reducing the employer portion of health premiums from 100% to 85%, requiring employee contributions to the trust, negotiating a reduced retiree medical benefit for new hires. Since the issuance of the grand jury report, the OPEB unfunded actual liability has dropped in 2 successive valuations from $124 million in the 2015 valuation to $78 million in the most recent valuation in 2019. The city has also fully funded the ADC ahead of the OPEB funding policy scheduled. The OPEB funding policy schedule for the last 3 fiscal years, which while building its general fund reserve. We'll go into more detail on the OPEB advisory committee a little later in the presentation, as this recommendation was implemented as well. Next slide, please. So for finding recommendation number 2, that materials provided to the City Council by staff failed to adequately address the long-term financial impact on OPEB. The recommendation was to direct staff to include fiscal impact of changes in methodology used in determining the financial impact in simpler language. And the second part was to prepare future communications for decision makers and stakeholders in simpler language to better explain the magnitude of OPEB debt and potential impacts. Next slide, please. So in its response, the city cited the unfunded liabilities white paper, which was presented to council in 2015, which resulted in the adoption of the OPEB funding policy and the presentation of the 2017 valuation by the independent actuary. Since the issuance of the report, the actuary has also presented the 2019 valuation results, which included an explanation of valuation terminology, the changes since the previous valuation, examples of the potential savings under Tier 3. We plan to continue this practice of having the actuary present the valuation results going forward. Additionally, the actuary also held a workshop Q&A session in January of 2020. Next slide, please. So for finding and recommendation number 3, the finding was that the city of Vacaville has not followed the other post-retirement funding policy, which contains incorrect information. The city has not made adequate ARC. So at the time, instead of it being referred to as the ADC, it was called the ARC, or annual required contribution, but it is the same thing as the ADC that we're referring to now. So as specified in the policy, the hardship provision does not adequately specify the recipient of the council's recommendation. And then for the recommendations, they were to correct the policy title to reflect post-employment rather than post-retirement, to comply with the other post-retirement funding policy as to the percentage of ARC, or the ARC, to be paid as set forth in the policy, to clarify the hardship exemption in the policy to provide a recipient for the city council's recommendation. Next slide, please. So at the time the grand jury report was written, the city had not met its policy goals in fiscal year 16 and 17. However, since that time, the city has fully funded the ADC ahead of the policy schedule while building on its general fund reserve. The other recommendations, so 3A, which was the OPEB policy title correction, and 3C, the hardship provision, were implemented through council action in November of 2019. Next slide, please. Crystal, can you jump back one more? All right, so finding recommendations number 4, the finding was placing OPEB issues such as healthcare premium rate changes on the consent calendar hinders public awareness of and input to city council decisions. The recommendation was to present issues pertaining to OPEB and retiree health premiums as separate agenda items. Next slide, please. So the city's response was that the city has implemented this recommendation of placing OPEB, retiree health premium related items, and MOUs as separate agenda items. So this is something that we have implemented since the report. Next slide, please. And then for finding number 5, it was changes in health plan rates announced by CalPERS were not brought before the city council and the public. The recommendation was to place these changes in the city's contribution towards retiree health care and or impact and OPEB liability on the agenda to be reviewed by the city council in a public forum. Next slide. So the city's response was that the city has implemented this recommendation of placing health plan rates announced by CalPERS on the agenda. So this is another item that we implemented as a response to the grand jury report. And then the most recent rate change was presented at the August 25th, 2020 council meeting. I will now pass it back to Jessica.
Next slide, please, Crystal. As Ken mentioned, the grand jury recommended the formation of an advisory group. City council agreed with this recommendation and established this group at a council meeting on 11/12 of 2019. This group was chaired by the city treasurer, Jay Yerk, and 4 members of the public were appointed to the group. These included Robert Denton, Laura Doherty, Jim Leland, and Sherry McBride. This group was supported by staff from the city manager's office, finance department, and human resources department. All meetings scheduled were open to the public. Next slide, please. A total of 8 public meetings were held. They included staff presentations, plus outside independent experts, including an actuary presentation, as Ken mentioned earlier, PERS staff presentation, and 3 different benefit brokers, all industry leaders in the field of employee benefits. The committee met for 120 days and completed the council adopted parameters of the group, including submission of their recommendations to council. Next slide, please. In the continuing interest of transparency, a dedicated internet page was created to utilize for information to the public following each advisory group meeting. Next slide, please. All resource documents provided to the committee were also posted to the website. It's a lot of information, and all of this information plus more is what staff uses on a regular basis to review, analyze, and keep current on health and other benefits, including researching and establishing Tier 3. Next slide, please. For the benefit of those council members that were not here at the time, we wanted to give a snapshot of the recommendation report received by the committee. This was presented to council on October 13th of 2020, consisted of two main recommendations, fiscal sustainability and defined contribution plans. The complete report is available as an attachment to the staff report on the 10/13/20 council meeting on the city's website. It's also available on the OPEB resource page we just had up, and it was given to each of you in your council binders. Next slide, please. One question we're often asked is, why do we stay with PERS Health? Some of the benefits to staying with PERS Health is the purchasing power to stabilize rates. CalPERS is the largest purchaser of health insurance in California. The plans cover actives and retirees. They offer several plans with no minimum enrollment requirements in any of the plans and very low administrative costs with no broker fees. Some of the issues with leaving CalPERS Health and challenges that are presented is that we cannot obtain utilization reports from CalPERS to get quotes. This could result in initial rates being less expensive, but once utilization is obtained and reviewed by those new plans, it can impact rates going forward. There's also an issue with rate smoothing or risk sharing if we're offering multiple plans. This is done to avoid adverse selection by the plans, and some plans require a minimum enrollment, including a total percentage of our employees. If we dip below that percentage, the plan could drop us. Also, once you leave CalPERS, you can't come back for 5 years. Next slide, please. Some items specific to the city of Vacaville are that we're not a good candidate for quotes with the percentage of Kaiser enrollment we have, currently around 75%. This makes it so that no other plans want to quote us. While having a high Kaiser enrollment is not a bad thing, it does limit our ability to go out for quotes. We do have good access to Kaiser here in Vacaville, so it's not surprising that we have high enrollment. The average age of our enrollee is high compared to other plans at 54, while the average of other plans is in the 40s. Significant population of non-Medicare covered employees at 25%, whereas most providers will not quote if this number is above 20. Staff has explored this topic and continues to monitor it, but when we did explore it, we received a decline to quote response due to the reasons mentioned here. Turn it back over to Ken. Next slide, please, Crystal.
Thanks, Jessica. So the following slide is a high-level summary of the OPEB valuation. So the purpose of the valuation, an actuarial valuation, is to determine the ADC, so the annual amount we need to fund in a given year, and measure our funding progress. The city's OPEB valuations, they've been prepared by the actuarial firm Milliman since 2008. The evaluation is performed every 2 years, with June 30th of 2019 being the most recent. And then our next valuation will be as of June 30th of 2021, so later this year, and it will include the most recent city census data, so such as number of employees, including Tier 3 employees, and also our retirees. It's important to note that since valuations project the cost of funding benefits in the future, they do rely on assumptions based on a variety of studies. So examples of demographic assumptions would be how long people are expected to live and when they would retire. Some examples of economic assumptions would be price inflation and how payroll would grow going forward. And then this table on the right is a summary of our 2019 valuation. So as of that date, we had an actual liability of $116.6 million. The value of assets that we had at that time was $38.4 million. As mentioned in the staff report, that has now grown to about $56 million. And then the unfunded actual liability was $78.2 million as of June 30th, 2019, which leaves us with a funding ratio of 33%. And then that unfunded liability, the valuation calls for that. Our plan is to amortize that over the next 17 years. So the amortization, you can think of that as like a mortgage amortization. So the plan is to pay off that unfunded liability within 17 years. Next slide, please. All right, so the following chart shows how our OPEB funding has been tracking since 2011. So the blue column represents the assets we had in the OPEB trust in that given year. So looking at 2011, the amount at that time was 8.7 million. And if you kind of take it all the way out to June of 2019, it's 38.4 million. The orange column represents the unfunded liability in that year. So in 2011, it was 71.5. And then it did grow until 2015, where you see it jumping to 124.7 million. And as mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, we have seen the unfunded liability decrease in the most recent valuations, where it drops to 82.8, to 17, and then in 78 to 78.2 million in 19. And then the gray line represents the ADC. So back in 2011, we were the valuation called for us funding 7.1 million in that year. And then in 2019, moving kind of along the years, for 2019, it called for funding at 9.5 million. And then the green callouts just are showing the progress made on the funded status. And so while 33% may seem low, it's important to kind of see the progress that's been made in recent years. And so in 2015, our funded status was 12%. You fast forward 4 years, we're at 33%. So we're definitely seeing progress with the different actions that have been taken over the years. Next slide, please. So the previous slide illustrated how OPEB has been tracking since 2011. The following slide illustrates how the unfunded actuarial liability, so the UAL, would be amortized over the next 17 years according to the data and the assumptions used in the 2019 valuation. The area shaded in blue represents the unfunded actuarial liability, which is at 78 million at the end of 2019. So that's at the very far left end, where you see the top of this blue curve, slightly under that 80 million in 2020. Thanks, Crystal. And then this would call for it to be paid off by 2039. And you kind of see how the unfunded liability is decreasing each year. And then the orange line represents the ADC. So in 2020, our ADC is under 10 million, and that progressively goes up to 2038, where we're at our peak ADC, projected to be slightly under 16 million. And then when that unfunded actual liability drops off, that is where you would see the ADC decline down to about 6 million. And kind of like what we had talked about earlier in the presentation, that ADC has two components to it. It's the unfunded liability, and then it's also the normal cost. And so that decline that you're seeing there is because once the unfunded liability is addressed, that what you're paying going forward is that normal cost. All right, next slide, please.
So we're going to just go into more detail on this current structure. As we mentioned earlier, this is kind of a breakout of that slide we saw at the beginning of the presentation. So for OPEB, our current structure with the Tier 3 that was recently adopted, this is for safety employees hired on or after 1/1 of 20 and non-safety employees hired on or after 12/1 of 18. We currently have 81 employees in Tier 3. Tier 3 provides a benefit of the PERS minimum requirement, which is currently $143. This is the benefit that they receive toward their health insurance in retirement. Additionally, based on total years of service, an employee can receive additional contribution of $200 a month if they reach the maximum of 20 plus years of service at the total PERS service and retired from the city of Vacaville. This is an example of more of a defined contribution. Also, while they're working for the city of Vacaville, a retiree health savings account is established for new hires, another defined contribution plan, and contributions are made from the city and the employee beginning after probationary period is completed by the new hire. The contributions start at a 50-50 split between the city and the employee and increase up to an 80-100 split after 10 years of city service, with the $100 being from the city. Employees must complete 5 years of city service before they're vested in this plan, meaning if they leave city service prior to that 5 years, they forfeit all city contributions. Tier 1 and Tier 2 are both closed plans, meaning no new entrants into these plans. And we have about 469 of our active employees currently in Tier 2 and just one left in Tier 1. Tier 2 is based on a vesting schedule with the maximum contribution listed below here at 20 years of service. And Tier 1 is based on current negotiated amounts by the bargaining unit. Next slide, please. This slide shows a breakdown by tier of what the city's contribution and the retiree's cost is for health. If you look at Tier 3, the maximum benefit a retiree can be given toward retiree medical is in the second column under city pays. This includes the $200 a month listed on the prior slide, plus the minimum required by CalPERS of $143 for a total of $343. Comparing this to Tier 2 benefit, where the city paid a total of $799 toward the single coverage. You'll notice the total premium amounts are the same, again, because this is all through CalPERS Health, so the total premium amount will remain the same for each tier. It's the contribution from the city that is different by tier. The most important thing to note here is the reduction in the city's future OPEB costs for this new tier. Just the example I gave for the retiree only is a 57% reduction in the future cost of OPEB for the city. And that's followed with a 77% reduction at a two-party plan and an 82% reduction at the family rate. Next slide, please. Also important to note is that once an employee reaches Medicare age, the city only contributes up to the single rate under Tier 3. So these premiums listed here reflect the PERS Medicare plan premiums currently in 2021. And they're used as an example of how that would work for a Tier 3 retiree once they reach Medicare. The city's contribution may cover 100% of the retiree only, but it would never increase for dependents. Next slide, please. In summary, Tier 3 was established on 12/1/18 for non-safety, 1/1/20 for safety. We have 81 new hires in that time period, and as of the last valuation, there were only 16 Tier 3 employees. The OPEB valuation is based on current liabilities, meaning existing retirees and existing employees, not future projections of future hires. This is one reason we don't have a good grip on the impacts of Tier 3 yet, because we haven't received a valuation that includes very many of our new hires into that tier. The next valuation scheduled for data based on 6/30/21 will contain all of these 81 employees, plus any new hires between now and then. This will give us a better sense of the impact of Tier 3 on OPEB. Next slide, please. Our next steps are to obtain actuarial studies every year to give us a better sense of those changes that we mentioned. Currently, we're doing them every other year, as Ken mentioned prior in the presentation. We would like to continue presentation of those studies in open session to council, which would obviously move to every year rather than every other year. Continue to track progress of Tier 3 implementation, and continue to monitor industry changes and options available. Next slide, please. We're going to move into the pension presentation now. Next slide, please, Crystal. So our current pension structure, as we outlined for OPEB, we have 3 tiers of pension. The PEPRA that is listed here for Tier 3 is the Public Employees Pension Reform Act. This was implemented by the state in response to the state identifying the unsustainable pension obligations that the majority of California public agencies were facing. You can see that the structure of PEPRA lists the formulas here. We're going to go into more detail on that. And then we have Tier 2 for other classic employees, and Tier 1 are closed plans as well, which is similar to OPEB. We'll go into more detail on those as well. Next slide, please. So just some definitions here. CalPERS is the California Public Employees Retirement System, and PARS is the Public Agency Retirement Services. Next slide. PARS was made effective on July 1st of 2001, and implemented a 0.7 at 55 formula for non-safety. This 0.7 was supplemental to the existing 2% at 55 formula with PERS to total a 2.7 at 55 benefit for employees. This was negotiated as an alternative to the recently approved PERS benefit of the same level. Other items were optional PERS benefits negotiated with labor and approved by council. These include military service credit for fire implemented in 2002, credit for unused sick leave for fire implemented in 2004, as well as improved disability retirement for fire that same year, a 3% at 50 retirement formula for fire safety implemented in 2006, pre-retirement death benefit for police implemented in 2008, and then the 3% at 50 formula for police implemented in 2009. In 2011, we implemented survivor continuance for police, and this resulted in a 15% increase to police safety employees that had already retired. This provision has since been removed from the CalPERS requirements, but it definitely impacted us at the time. Any implementation of an optional benefit will impact the city's pension costs and specifically unfunded liabilities. Next slide, please. Council has recognized the need to address pension liability, and they did so prior to implementation of PEPRA and directed staff to negotiate a new lower tier for safety employees at that time. So effective with anyone hired on September 1st of 2012 or later in a safety position, this was where Tier 2 was created for our safety employees with implementation of the 2% at 50 formula. Effective 1/1/13, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act was implemented, and it essentially eliminated our PARS plan, so that became a closed plan because the Pension Reform Act did not allow for supplemental plans. So Tier 2 for our non-safety is 2 at 55. Then 2 mandated formulas implemented by PEPRA created our Tier 3s on both safety and non-safety sides with 2 at 62 and 2.7 at 57. In 2015, pension cost sharing agreements were reached with our groups through council direction, and we currently have 3% cost share from our safety groups and 1% from most of our non-safety groups. I'm going to turn it back over to Ken. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Jessica. So for pension, there are differences in the timing and structure of the valuation reports completed by PERS and PARS, which I will highlight in this slide. So for PERS, the valuation is done annually, with the most recent one being that June 30th, 2019 valuation. And the way the valuation is used is that first provides that the 19 valuation, it was done, provided to us in the summer of 2020. And then what we do is it establishes the rates that we are going to have to pay in fiscal year 22. So there is a lag between when the valuation is done, when it's provided to the city, and then when that the results of that valuation will impact our rates. And so with the most recent valuation at 19, that is going to set the rates that we have to pay in fiscal year 22. The valuation is performed by CalPERS actuaries, and the discount rate that they are currently using is 7%. For PARS, the valuation report is performed every 2 years, so similar to OPEB. It's performed by Milliman, so it is not the same actuary, but it's the same firm. And then if we go over to the table on the right, jumping back to PARS, for the discount rate for PARS, it's 6.5%, so that is one of the differences between PERS and PARS. So for PERS, they're using a 7% discount rate, and then for PARS, they're using 6.5%. So for the table on the right, for PERS, as of the June 30th and 19 valuation date, our actual liability was a little over $610 million. The value of the assets was $400 million, leaving us with an unfunded liability of $209.8 million and a funded ratio of 66%. And then for the remaining amortization, so the reason why there's a 4 to 29 years listed here is that whereas for PARS and OPEB, the unfunded liability, we're amortizing that over kind of a single closed period, similar to a mortgage. With PERS, each year that they do a valuation and those results come in, and if those results are positive compared to the assumptions they had in place, we see what's called an actuarial gain, which would reduce the unfunded liability. If the results are actually worse than the assumptions that they had put in place, then we would see an actuarial loss. And so for each one of those years, that year's gain or loss or base is amortized on its own. And so for PERS, you can kind of think of it as a basket of mortgages. So that really our oldest base has 4 years of amortization left, whereas our more recent ones are 29 years. So that is why that you see a different years under the amortization section for PERS. And then for PARS, our actual liability was a little over $60 million on June 30th of 19. Our value of assets were slightly under $21 million, leaving us with an unfunded liability of $39.7 million. It gives us a funded ratio of 34%. And then very similar to OPEB, we are amortizing the entire unfunded liability over 20 years. And so that is similar to how we're handling OPEB as well, where in 20 years, that unfunded liability, the plan would be to have that fully amortized. Next slide, please. All right, so for CalPERS, there are changes that they make that we do not have control over. And so then that do have an impact on the liability and our contributions going forward. These are changes that CalPERS had to make to help the system become more sustainable, and there are changes that are needed, but they do have an impact on the public agencies. And so for discount rate, back in December of 2016, the CalPERS board adopted a 7% discount rate, and they phased that in over 3 years. And so with the 2016 valuation, they had dropped the discount rate, which was 7.5 at the time. They dropped it down to 7.375. And in the 2017 valuation, that was dropped down to 7.25%. And since the 2018 valuation, they've been the discount rate that's been used is the 7%. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, so lower rates do result in increased liabilities and contributions for public agencies like ourselves. And then CalPERS has a 4-year review process called the Asset Liability Management Review, and where they look at things such as what they're going to invest in and the appropriate discount rate. And so this was planned for calendar year 2020, but because of COVID, this was moved out to 2021. And so in that October, November 2021 timeframe, CalPERS will be looking at the discount rate again, seeing if that 7% is still appropriate or if it needs to be lowered. And so depending on the action they take there, if they were to lower it, then we would see an increase in liabilities and our contributions going forward. Another change that they had was a modification to the actuarial valuation system, which was as of June 2018. And so further valuation system, the things that would change would be the assumptions that they use in that. So assumptions on inflation, payroll growth, mortality rates, that would be part of the things that they have updated as part of their actuarial process that were implemented in 2018. And then the most recent change that they made was their new amortization policies that we're seeing as of the most recent valuation. And so for those gains and losses that I referred to earlier, each year when PERS does a valuation, you'll see a gain or a loss. Those were being amortized over 30 years. They've shrunk that down or reduced it down to where going forward, starting with the 2019 valuation, those are now being amortized or paid off in 20 years. Next slide, please. And so similar to the OPEB slide that we had earlier, this shows our funding status and our progress on the pension side back in 2015. So the blue column represents the assets that we have set aside. And so there are 2 columns under each year. So the column on the left is for PARS. So for PARS in 2015, we had $15.3 million set aside with an unfunded liability of $32.2 million. For PERS, our assets set aside were $324 million with the unfunded liability at $152 million. And then for the years 2016 and 18, you'll notice that there's not a PARS column, and it's not because the liability went away in those years, but what this chart is representing is the liability and assets that were provided in the years that evaluation was available. And so with PERS, we have that for every single year. For PARS, since we're having evaluation, we have evaluation done every 2 years. That is why you're not seeing that column on the PARS for 16 and 18. So The liability does increase from 152.2 million in 15 for PERS up to where we see in 2019, it's at 209.8 million. And then on the PAR side, it was 32.2 million in 2015, increasing to 39.7 million in 2019, so the most recent valuation. Next slide, please. And similar to the amortization slide we had for OPEB earlier, this slide illustrates how the PERS unfunded actual liability, so that 209.8 million, would be amortized over time using that the June 30th of 2019 data and assumptions. So this is a new tool that CalPERS has made available that wasn't previously available to us and is not in the valuation reports. And so for the unfunded actual liability, you see in 2019 where it's at that 209 million. And then this looks at kind of how it progresses through 2041, so 20 years from now, and how that decreases over time. And that is the blue shaded area. And then the orange line is the ADC. So the ADC, which is our annual payment for the valuation report that we need to make to fund the unfunded liability. In 2021, it's 23.3 million. Under this projection, it peaks in 2029 at 30.2 million, and that's when you start to see the impacts of PEPRA, so the lower cost that's associated with PEPRA employees. And you can kind of think of 2029 as where we're like at the top of the hill, and under this projection, we're starting to come down the hill, and that ADC, the annual payment, is starting to lower because of that transition to PEPRA employees. Next slide, please. All right. So there are several reports, surveys out there on fiscal health. The data on this slide is from the report put together annually by the California State Auditor. And so the California State Auditor, they've been doing this report, I believe, for the last 3 years, where they're ranking the 450 plus cities in fiscal health. And the risk indicators that they use include the general fund reserves. So you get more points for how many months of reserves you have. They look at the debt burden, so outside of the unfunded liabilities. They look at liquidity, so how much general fund cash and investments we have compared to our general fund liabilities. They look at revenue trends, so how we trended over the last 3 years. And they're also looking at the unfunded liabilities such as pension and OPEB. And Vacaville, according to the most recent survey and the ones prior, like a majority of the cities in California, we are in that moderate risk category, which is kind of highlighted in yellow. That's hard to see. And our strengths are in our reserves, our liquidity, and our revenue. That's where our strengths are. And then our challenges are with our unfunded liabilities, and that's what knocks us down in the survey. But if you look at the table on the right, it's kind of Vacaville's ranking over time. So since this report has been put together in 2016-17, and then the way that the chart or the ranking is set up, you don't want to be number one on this. You want to be closer to 450. And so in 2017, we were ranked 100. And then, despite the unfunded liabilities challenge, and we know that there are challenges there, you do see an improvement over time in our fiscal health. So we are trending in a positive direction. We went from 117 to 152 in 18, and then we're ranked 174th in 2019. If you go to the next slide. So with this slide, whereas the previous slide kind of is the comparison compared to the other 450 cities in California, which are different sizes, this chart looks at the cities that are more relative to us in size. So with us having a population slightly over 100,000, this is looking at other cities with a population between 75 to 125K. And again, while we definitely have the unfunded liability, that challenge that we need to continue to address, when you look at where we compare in fiscal health compared to other cities in our size, we are kind of right in the middle. We're not on the bottom, we're not on that lower end, but we are kind of smack in the middle. So while there is definitely improvement needed, we are kind of in the middle of others when compared to cities of a similar size. Next slide, please. So for next steps related to pension, what we would like to do is similar to the steps that we're taking with OPEB. We would like to come back to council at a future meeting, exploring the idea of adopting a pension funding policy. We would also like to look at creating a pension rate stabilization trust, so similar to how we set up a trust for OPEB, which we've definitely seen positive results with. We want to take similar action and look into creating a pension rate stabilization trust. And this is an item that when the League of Cities did a report on unfunded liabilities in 2018, this was an item that they had as a recommendation. There's hundreds of cities that do it throughout the state, and if we're even looking at the county, there are 2 other agencies, Fairfoot and Vallejo, that have already implemented this. We also want to start having an annual unfunded liabilities council meeting, to where we're taking this annually, and right when the valuation reports come out, bringing this to council and talking about it, similar to what we're doing this evening. Next up, please, or next slide, please. And so in summary, for the next steps on the OPEB side, it would be to obtain an actual study every year. So moving from the 2 years to doing that annually, continue the presentation of those studies and continue presentation of those studies in open sessions. So moving that to every year. Continue to track progress of Tier 3 implementation. Continue to monitor industry changes and options. On the pension side, like I mentioned earlier, it's exploring the adoption of a funding policy, looking at establishing a pension rate stabilization trust, and then with the OPEB valuation report and the pension valuation reports really coming out around the same time, kind of late summer, early fall, doing a presentation to cover unfunded liabilities with the most recent valuation information at that time. That concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm looking for council comments. I see no hands up, but I'm sure they're going to pop up. Vice Mayor Nolan Sullivan, please.
I have a lot of questions. So I'll just dive into them. So the first one is just a kind of a rumor that I wanted to clarify. So on the UL reduction from 124 million to 78 million, we talk a lot about that reduction and how that, shows that we're making some good progress there. Can you dive into kind of the background, the mechanics as to what happened there? There is a rumor that there were some accounting miscalculations, I guess, if you will, where we included some deceased employees that sort of inflated the original cost. But can you talk a little bit about that $124.6 million reduction to the $78.2 million reduction? Was that because we increased more? Did our funds do better? Was accounting miss? What exactly was behind that reduction is question number one.
Okay, I can respond to that. So you typically do not see the unfunded liability fall as drastically as it did. And so that is not something that we anticipate it dropping by that amount every single year. I'm not sure about the deceased employee part. I know that when looking at that report, the 2 biggest things that contributed to that decline would be the health rate assumptions. And so as part of the assumptions that the actuary uses, they're making an assumption on how health rates are going to move in future years. And compared to the 2015 report, the health rate assumption had declined. And so that had a big part to do with the decline that we were seeing. It's just that the assumption on the health rates had gone down. Another part too had to do with an accounting change. And so when you mentioned accounting, there was a one-time change related to accounting, and it had to do not with anything internally here at the city, but with GASB 75 and the way that that had to be reported. Our actuary had changed the way that the liability gets amortized. And so prior to 2017, that valuation, the way the liability was being amortized, it was being amortized evenly over kind of the life of the liability. And then that was moved to where it started to get amortized and move similar to payroll. And I guess the best example I could make would be if, let's say in 10 years, I said I was going to pay you $100. And over that 10-year period, I have to put money aside to fund that under the method that it was under in 2015. Just ignoring interest for this example, I would be putting $10 aside every single year for 10 years to get to that $100. And so the way that the liability was being kind of realized or amortized prior to 2017 is that it was even across the board. And so if 2 years had passed and I had put no money aside, the unfunded liability would be $20. What the 2017 valuation did was that it was changed to where the liability, the way that gets amortized is it follows payroll growth. And so you're going to see lower liability in the early years and then a higher liability in the latter years. And so kind of using that $100 example, I can't really do all the math, but you know, in the first 2 years, maybe the liability for year one, $6, the year two, it's $7, and that's gradually moving up. And so the unfunded liability as of the date of the valuation is going to be lower because of that.
Okay, thank you. I have a series of, I guess, OPEB related benefits or questions. I'm trying to organize my notes here, sorry. So first question is, so I've asked this a couple times and I struggle to get an answer on this one, and it could just be me not understanding it. So can you calculate an actual cash benefit for an active employee receiving OPEB? And the question I'm sort of asking is, if I wanted to pay into a private insurance plan to essentially pay the same healthcare benefits on my retirement privately, what would my premium costs be today? So my question to you is, can we calculate the average employee cost per month that essentially is compensation or the value of that plan that is benefiting employees on a monthly basis? Is that possible?
Are you talking about current costs, Vice Mayor?
Yeah. So I mean, like right now, for example, if I were buying a private current cost, yes. So the current cost for an active employee, what is the cashable benefit amount? So let's say they make $3,000 in salary and they make $1,000 in healthcare. What is the value of the OPEB benefit to them monthly?
Are you talking about like for creating an amount that can be used for something like comparison and total compensation, that kind of thing?
Yes, something along those lines.
Yeah, we've talked about that in great detail with our consultant that performs our total compensation survey, because we do realize that putting a value on that would be very helpful. But what we found is that there's too many variables. You don't know when an employee is going to retire. You don't know what plan they're going to choose. You don't know how many dependents they're going to have. And you don't know the cost of the plan at the time. So to put that into a specific dollar amount, there's just too many variables to make it be kind of an accurate assumption or estimate.
Could we ask our actuary to try? Or is it just still too many variables?
We could ask that question and find out what they say.
Okay. And that kind of dovetails into my next question. Do other cities in California currently offer similar benefits, either tier 1, 2, or 3? I know at one point in time other cities did. I've heard that there's very few cities comparable to that offer this benefit or offered it. And I guess that's why it's so hard to comp, because you're not exactly comping apples to apples. Are we aware of any current California cities that offer a tier 3 even, or maybe that we can comp on a tier 2 or tier 1 in benefit comps?
When we collect our total compensation data, we do ask for that to be collected as an exhibit and what their current retiree medical benefit is. We do it just for those agencies that we're doing total comp surveys on to keep it consistent. And we are in contact with other agencies on a regular basis to explore thoughts and ideas and what's been implemented. Ken and I have recently reached out to other agencies that have implemented something similar to Tier 3 in hopes to get some idea of what their actuarial studies have looked like. So we do reach out. Every benefit design that we see is just a little bit different, so it makes it really hard to compare apples to apples. There are a lot of agencies in PERS, but again, their benefit design within their specific MOUs are all over the place. So we do try to collect that information through our total comp survey.
Okay. All right, and again, that's the hard part for me sometimes, right? Because we can compare salary to salary, medical benefit to medical benefit, specialty pay to specialty pay, but OPEB really never has a comparison that is comparable, and so we sort of kind of don't talk about it or don't really include it in the comps from my limited experience, and so that is an area I just want to make sure we're paying fair benefits, and that if we're ignoring the value of OPEB because we can't find comps, there's got to be some sort of way to factor that in terms of value. Another question kind of along the OPEB line. So I know we've established an OPEB trust, which is fantastic, and we've been funding that, and that's growing and growing and growing. We have a governor who sort of ran on the promise of universal health care, and we'll see if he actually tries to do that or not. And then we actually have, Biden has talked about enhancing, single payer or something along those lines. What would happen to the OPEB trust if single payer was implemented, or Medicare for all, or some variation of that were implemented in California? Could we spend those funds on other things for employees, or what would happen to that trust?
Sure. So for the OPEB trust, the amount that's in there can only be used for OPEB. So we couldn't redirect that money and use it to, build a park, for example. That money could only be used for OPEB related items. So paying, anything related to retiree medical or OPEB.
Okay. Have we thought about what would happen if universal health care or single payer healthcare was implemented? I mean, is that something we're looking at?
We track all legislation that's coming through regarding health plans, and we have outside assistance with that as far as a broker is concerned, and CalPERS keeps up to date on all of that and has constituent work group meetings. I have not heard anything about that coming back to legislation in California at this point.
Okay. So my last question, and this sort of dovetails into the OPEB work group that we had a while back, is have we ever looked at more affordable options or other options to see if they could be more affordable and provide the same level of benefit? I mean, did we do any shopping around, I guess? And I'm probably asking this in a really plain and silly way, but what have we done to competitively kind of make sure that we're getting the best value for our employees, not reducing quality, but making sure that the cost for the OPEB plan is the most affordable it can be, or do we even have options to do that?
Sure, yeah, we continuously look at that. Crystal, could you go back to slide 26 for me, please?
Yep, give me 1 sec.
So, Vice Mayor, we continuously keep our feelers out and our ear to the ground on all things like this that could provide options. Obviously, that's part of just what we do for all of our benefits, not just health. We always want to know if we're, in a good spot financially, and or if there are any other better benefits out there for us. So when I went over this slide for PERS versus not PERS, what we have found each time we have asked about this is the things listed here on leaving PERS Health and the challenges that presents. We have reached out to other agencies, one of which recently, within the last 5 years, left CalPERS and had adopted kind of a similar tier 3 than us, but they also left CalPERS at that time, right after adopting that similar tier 3. So what they let us know was due to the items listed kind of here where they had no utilization to go out and get quotes, their initial rates upon going outside of CalPERS were good. They were less expensive. But they did use rate smoothing, and that tends to be an industry standard from our understanding. So that means if we're going to offer more than one plan, which right now we have many plans offered through CalPERS, that some of those plans will require a certain amount of enrollment. And what a broker will do on the back end to make those plans attractive for employees is to kind of take the savings that you may receive from one plan, like a Kaiser, and increase the the premium for that Kaiser plan so that it can decrease the premium for the other plan that may not have been so attractive. Because if we don't reach those minimums, like we mentioned, then you don't get a renewal. You get a decline to renew. So one of the nice things about CalPERS is that we would never get a decline to renew. We would never get kicked out of the plan. So we don't have that concern going forward. Whereas if we left CalPERS, we would be out on our own kind of trying to establish what plans we could get, even through some of the pooled options out there. So that's one issue. And then the next slide, Crystal, 27, really, these are specific to Vacaville, and what we have found each time that we've asked about it too is our Kaiser enrollment is really high, so it makes it so other plans really don't want to quote us. And again, that's not a bad thing. We have Kaiser facilities right here in Vacaville, which is great. And a lot of employees enjoy the benefits of Kaiser. So I hope I'm addressing your question, but yeah, we definitely go out and ask this question and try to keep.
Yeah, and I actually have some questions on slides 26 and 27 too, so you jumped right ahead to where I was going anyway. So, I use Kaiser myself, and I use CalPERS through my daily employer, and my CalPERS rate through my employer is about $1,000 a paycheck more than it is to buy directly through Kaiser. So you mentioned that there's 75%. So what I've chosen to do, or I've done in the past, is I've opted out, taken the cash in lieu of payment, and paid directly through Kaiser, which I believe is probably cheaper for the employer, and it's also far cheaper for me and my family. And the CalPERS rates, I think what happens is kind of like you said. So I've got a younger family, so I have lower rates. So they kind of use my rates, they jack them up to smooth them out for folks that might be a little older that have higher rates. But then they also add on some surcharges and fees and brokerages for what, providing the service. If we have 75% of our members are Kaiser anyways, couldn't we just try to get a quote directly through Kaiser and cut out CalPERS completely?
Kaiser, my understanding is that Kaiser would have a difficult time quoting us because we wouldn't have utilization to show them. So it would be hard to get a strictly Kaiser benefit outside of CalPERS due to that.
So, I guess on the slide, the last slide, you talk about the benefits of staying with CalPERS and kind of why we shouldn't. I mean, I guess I really kind of feel like CalPERS sort of holds California City sort of hostage on this because they hold your rates and they box you out for 5 years. I mean, have we ever taken a deep dive on the benefits to leaving CalPERS? And again, I'm not trying to reduce the benefit quality to any of our employees. I just feel like CalPERS is gouging us. And I'm wondering if there's a better way. And I know on the exchange, we can purchase far cheaper health insurance directly. I just don't really understand the value of CalPERS for the city. So do most cities use CalPERS for healthcare?
Yeah, I don't know the numbers. That's a good question. I don't have the numbers in front of me on how many California cities are currently enrolled in CalPERS.
Okay.
I know there's a lot. And there's some that aren't in CalPERS and do their own thing. There's some, CalPERS, the last time I heard a presentation from them, they had, so many agencies leaving CalPERS, but they had more agencies joining CalPERS than they had leaving, and they had several coming back. So again, we have looked at this in the past, and we continue to always know that it's something we need to explore and always have a feel for what's out there. So even prior to Tier 3, I mean, for probably the last 10 years that I've been involved in benefits as much as I have, we're always looking at this option. We're always exploring what's out there. So it's not something that's new just because of our OPEB focus lately.
Right.
It's something that we're always looking at. We're always reaching out for more information.
Well, this is one of those areas where I know PERS kind of does this big, bad, scary stuff to kind of ward us off, but I really do think there's possibilities here. And again, it's thousands of dollars difference per month in premiums. And as we continue to ratchet up the employee share of health costs through negotiation, they're paying more too. So it's not just good for the city, it's good for our employees. They're getting the same health care for twice the price, essentially, through CalPERS sometimes. And I just feel like there's got to be a better way. I would really encourage we take a look at the benefits of looking outside of CalPERS. It sounds like we kind of look at all the restrictions and the scary stuff, but like what could the possibilities be? And I know there's some creative things now with individual coverage health reimbursement accounts where folks are being paid cash in lieu of benefits. And there were some law changes under the last federal administration that allowed some updates in 2020 where employees can actually go out on the exchange and buy their own insurance, oftentimes better insurance for cheaper than they were paying through their employer because of issues like this. So I really think there's room to be creative and save employees some money, get them better quality plans, and save the city some money. My last 2 or 3 questions here. Can you go to slide 32, please? So on slide 32, so the city payment rate though, this would change as the rates go up for health insurance every year, this would also increase, or if the rates miraculously decrease, which I think I've ever seen, these would decrease as well. The city pays column, is that correct, or are these fixed?
Correct. Those for tier 3, are you talking about the 343?
Well, the tier 3 is going to stay static, right? It's going to stay 343, or does that go up or down?
The only part of that changes is the minimum monthly required contribution from CalPERS. So currently it's $143.
Okay.
But yes, the rest of that number definitely stays static.
But tier 2 and tier 1 though, those would increase as rates go up every year. Those go up every year as well, right? We have no control over that.
Exactly. So those are not fixed rates, and we're at the mercy of whatever the total premium is.
Okay, I have one more salary-related question, then I have a couple questions on the OPEB trust. I'm sorry, guys, for taking up so much time. Can an employee ever make more than 100% of their salary when retired? So if, let's say they made, I don't know, $100,000 working as an employee, if based on the city's retirement rates and specialty pays and all the different things we have, could that employee make above 100,000 when they're retired?
CalPERS has a cap on safety retiree pensions at 90%. An employee cannot make over 90% of their salary. For non-safety employees, that's not the case. I believe, though, at our current formula, you'd have to work close to 40 years to get to the 100% level of your current salary. So
is there a cap on specialty pays? Could specialty pays, if you combine that with your regular salary, put you over that 100%?
No, because that's actually considered part of your salary when it comes to pension. Okay. So we call those pension reportable income. Okay. So any pension reportable income is considered part of salary for pension calculation purposes.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you. A few more questions. I'm sorry, guys. Can you explain, you had a slide on this, but this is the area that I'm the least, I'm always confused about it. Can you talk about how Medicare interplays with our current plans for retirees and their spouses? Does our plan supplant Medicare? Is there a way to increase contributions from Medicare and lower the city's cost, but keeping the same program quality for our participants? There was a slide, I think, yeah, here you go. Can you kind of go into this one more time in detail? I just really don't understand this concept, and I would appreciate some clarification.
Sure. So again, for Medicare, when a retiree becomes Medicare eligible, they have to sign up for Medicare Parts A and B on their own. It's a requirement of CalPERS Health. So if you want to maintain your CalPERS Health plan as a retiree, you have to sign up for Parts A and B. You have to pay your own Medicare premiums as a retiree. Same with all their dependents. They need to pay their own. The city does not reimburse Medicare eligible retirees for their share of Medicare. So then in turn, what happens is the plans that PERS has set up for Medicare eligible retirees have a reduced total premium. So you can see that here reflected in the total premium column. Those premiums are dictated through CalPERS based on Medicare, and they are like Kaiser Senior Advantage, for example. That is a Medicare plan through Kaiser, and I believe these are the actual rates for that Medicare plan. So in addition to the Medicare premiums that a retiree is paying, they also would pick up their share of any leftover premium listed here. So These premiums do not include the cost of Medicare. A retiree-only premium is $324.48 currently. So if we have a retiree under Tier 3 who reaches Medicare age, enrolls in Medicare, the city would contribute 100% of that premium going forward. The important difference between Tier 3 and our other tiers here is that that's where the city's contribution stops. We no longer would provide any additional amount toward a retiree plus dependents or a family.
Okay.
Is that answering your question, Vice Mayor?
It does. I see the changes. I don't quite understand the Medicare piece on the Tier 2 and Tier 1, but I think I understand the change or where we headed there. So I guess the question is there any room left to have Medicare chip in more and lower the city's cost, but not alter the quality of care for retirees with any of our current tiers? Not really as stated, correct?
No, we don't have any control over what Medicare covers.
Okay.
For the retirees.
And then my last two questions are about the OPEB advisory group. So from what I remember on the 1013 meeting, I believe we voted to table the recommendations and wait for the new council to kind of hear and get direction. And I think that's probably what we're doing tonight. What is the status of all the recommendations that, Ken, I think you talked about, and I apologize if I'm misquoting, but what is the status of the recommendations from that group? And then also, is there any possibility that group could come back and report out to the new council? I think Jeremy was the lead staff member for them, and none of the new council members were here. It would be kind of interesting to hear from them again. We kind of just paused it and stopped from my recollection, but can you correct my memory if I'm wrong?
I might ask the city manager to step in on a little bit of this, but in my review of the October meeting, there was no action taken by council. The report was received, and that was the extent of the action taken by council that night.
So we didn't pursue any of the group's recommendations, right?
Correct.
Okay, and are we being asked to do that tonight, or are we just being informed that that was their recommendations?
You're just being informed.
Okay. Okay. I think that covers most of my questions. Sorry, I had a lot of notes. I really appreciate your time, and this is a super complicated subject, and I really appreciate you helping boil it down for me.
Sure. Mr. Vice Mayor, I just want to address one thing. I do want to go back to the exploring other options. We have actually engaged with our broker, Alliant, and specifically given them information, data, and information for them to do a feasibility study on going outside of CalPERS and what that would look like. And that's where we received those results on not being quoted for most of the benefits.
Gotcha. Thank you. I appreciate it. And again, this is probably not even just a city thing. It's just in my day job too, it just CalPERS drives me crazy, and I feel like we're kind of getting held hostage to pay these crazy rates when there's a better way. But thank you. I appreciate that.
Councilmember Stockton.
Thank you. I had a question as it related to the ALM review regarding who decides what they invest in with PERS. And I was curious to know, what part does the city play in that review process, and where can we look into seeing where, which companies or which mutual funds or stocks or they're investing in for that? I want to make sure that they're not handcuffing our ability to maximize our returns, because I know some years the economy does really well, but the CalPERS returns are still super low. Do you have any information on that?
As far as the city's part in it and how we have our voice heard, it would be to attend the board meetings. Those are public meetings, and so similar to our council meetings, it would be us as the agency attending those board meetings and voicing, our opinion on how that should occur. But that is the avenue, though, would be to do it through that board meeting process. As far as what they invest in, I don't have that information this evening, but it's something I can circle back and get.
Okay, my next question is there any way that we can get a better idea of what PEPRA looks like when it kicks in? I know you showed on that slide in 2029, PEPRA employees, I think, are going to be a more significant portion of the people that are employed at the city. Is there a way that we can look at that more in depth to just kind of to try to forecast as much as possible to see kind of what those impacts are going to be? Is that possible to do?
Sure, like outside of the tools, that slide that we went over, because that does kind of look at that impact over time. So when we actually start to see that transition to PEPRA, that's where you see that bending of the curve, where for the ADC, how that number starts to go down. So that would be the impact. It's the PERS slide, the pension slide, Crystal.
Okay. Okay, slide 30. That's what I was looking for, slide 30.
And then as far as the cost for a PEPRA employee versus a classic employee, I'd have to pull the valuation up, but then that would be another way to look at it as well, is to look at, you know, what the employer cost is related to a PEPRA employee versus a classic, but and that kind of determines how much we're having to contribute to fund pension.
Okay. And then the last thing, I don't know if this is possible or not, but my understanding is, I mean, it sounds like this problem started in 1975 and has been kind of going since then. Some of the returns on PERS in the early years were the returns that were gained from CalPERS. Did those take over the payments that the city was supposed to put into being an actual asset for the OPEB and for the OPEB and the PERS and PARS liabilities, the unfunded liabilities? Is there a way to look at what contributions the city has put into those assets over the life of us being in providing that benefit and being involved in CalPERS?
So just to clarify, are you looking for kind of a historical on our contribution to PERS?
Right, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, you know, in the early years when PERS was booming, we didn't have to actually make contributions because the returns were so high. So, you know, the money that could have been contributed toward our assets, which are now in the rears, are gone because of the returns meant that we didn't have to pay or put that money into the piggy bank, right? So is there a way to get a historical perspective on the contributions that the city has actually made? I understand PERS is a mutual fund, and so it fluctuates, but it would be interesting to see how much money we've put in, when we started to put money in, and when the problems kind of started, just to get a better idea of it. And if that's already exists, please, if you could direct me to where I could find that information, that'd be fantastic. And that's my last question.
Sure. So you are correct. So like, you know, I think it was the early 2000s when it was super funded is kind of the term that was used, where the assets were greater than the liabilities. And as far as to get the information on how much we've contributed, you know, the amount that we have to contribute is in the valuation reports. Our CAPR would also have our contributions as well. So for each year, how much we've contributed, with the CAPR, it's been easier to find after they had made some accounting rule changes. So I'd say probably the easiest way to get the information would be for us to put it together prior to kind of the accounting changes.
Okay, thank you. I just think it would be good to see the historical, I guess, pathway that has led us to where we are right now, because it sounded like from the Vice Mayor's question that you don't anticipate us being able to continue to have $46.4 million. Well, it sounds like we made up that 46, I think it was 46.4, $46.5 million from the original 124 of the OPEB. You don't anticipate that to be a continuing trend, is that correct?
That's correct. And just to clarify, so when I was talking earlier, like in response to your questions, that was on the pension side. So even the super funded,
Right.
when we were talking about it being super funded, it was on pension. The 40 plus million that the vice mayor was referring to, so that's on OPEB. And so for our OPEB trust, we started putting money aside in 2009. And so we can definitely, it would be easy for us to put together how much we've contributed. I think if you give me like 5 or 10 minutes, I could actually let you know how much we've contributed since the start of the OPEB trust and kind of how much of that is investment earnings. Just the fact that since we put money in, in 2009, it was really at the end of the Great Recession. And so really prior to the pandemic, our timing, I really couldn't have been better on the OPEB trust, where we were really seeing positive investment. We weren't seeing like a recession really until the pandemic. But I think if you give me 5 minutes, I can let you know how much the contributions to the trust have been.
Right, and that would be great. And I know that you discussed trying to do something similar on the other side to chip away at like the PERS PAR side to chip away as well. So would that money come from be negotiated through the contributions that the employees would pay?
So the way I've seen it done with other cities is, cities that have, larger reserves. I think I would think of it similar to like paying off a mortgage, or if you have credit card debt. If you have, a substantial amount of money in your savings account, the money that you have in your savings account, it doesn't earn a ton of interest. Whereas, your credit card debt or your mortgage, they usually have higher expenses tied to them or higher interest tied to them. And so the approach I've seen a lot of other cities take is that, they look at their general fund reserve, and they would kind of determine, one approach would be looking at, we want to maintain a reserve of, let's say, 25%. And so any amount that's above that amount, we're going to start putting towards either making additional payment to the unfunded liability or putting money towards the trust. Just because you have a better, it's just you get more bang for your buck by going that route. So that's definitely an approach I've seen. Another approach would be similar to what we're doing with OPEB. So in years where our revenues exceed our expenses, a percentage of that surplus each year goes to funding a trust or paying your unfunded liabilities. So those are two of the approaches I've seen. But I think for a majority of the agencies, it really is kind of looking at your reserves, kind of determining what's an appropriate amount. And then, whatever surplus you can spare, it's really putting it towards addressing your unfunded liabilities. And I have the answer on the contributions as well. So on the OPEB side, for the trust, since we initially started it, we contributed about $33 million into the trust. And this was as of December of 2020. The investment earnings on it have been about $21.4 million. And so like the net annualized return is about 9.56%. That's kind of what we've earned since we started this back in 2009.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Councilmember Wiley.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's a lot going on with both the OPEB and pensions and everything, but it is time that we really need to get it squared away and figure out that we're going in the right direction. I have a question on slide 34 that showed the tier and the number of employees. And I think you only showed active employees there, 81 in tier 3 and 469 employees in tier 2. So I was wondering about how many retirees are there in tier 1 and tier 2?
That's a good question, Councilmember Wiley. I don't have that information with me, but it is something we can get from our most recent actuarial report.
Because that's one thing that I'm, interested in. We have a lot of retirees as well. And so then on the one slide that you said, the average age of our employees is 54, which isn't far from retirees. And our retirees are going to be adding a lot. I mean, we're going to have a lot more people retiring in the next, 20 years as these charts and graphs all showed going down. So it's just real important to look at the number of retirees we have. And when I was doing work with, the health benefits for Travis School. I heard the same thing that you talked about. We had a high percentage of people in Kaiser. When people opt out, then, you really have a smaller group. So I totally understand, what you're going on with that. And I want to know, are retirees and actives in the same group, or are they separated out?
For health insurance purposes, they're all in the same group. We cannot separate them out, and which results in part of our unfunded liability called the implicit rate subsidy, which I know how to say those words, but I don't know how to explain what it is. So Ken would have to do that for us. But ultimately, it means that, we it smooths those rates out for the retirees and the younger population. But to go back to your first question, Councilmember Wiley, about the numbers in each tier, on that slide that we indicated the average age, that actually is specific to early retirees, is what they're called when we go out for market on health insurance. And an early retiree means anybody under age 65 that's already retired. So anybody pre-Medicare age that's retired. So that's, for the city, that right now is a lot of people between the ages of 50 and 65. So that's where our average age 54 comes from.
Okay, and because we saw 48 slides, so tell me the context of that. So we have the average age of the people who have already retired but have not reached 65?
Correct.
The average age of enrollee.
Yeah, so this slide here shows, this is specific to Vacaville on why we have trouble getting quotes from other plans, is that the average age of our pre-Medicare retiree is 54.
All right, so they've already retired, but they haven't reached Medicare.
Correct.
Okay. And I totally understand that too, because that was the issue. If people retired early, then there was no coverage for them unless they got it on their own. That was the plan that we had. But we are paying, the city is paying for the retirees in that interim. And after they retire, but they're not 65, they pay the full cost for them, correct?
Yeah, so they're early retirees for purposes of Medicare, but not early retirees for purposes of our pension. So that's what drives a lot of the retirement age, is our pension side of things. And when our formulas are conducive to employees retiring between ages 50 and 55.
Right, and that's also a big issue. If you do have families who who can go out on their own, then you're also driving the age up. So then that makes it higher for the people that are left in the plan. So that's an issue as well. Okay, so here's the next question. And on all those graphs where the blue part of the unfunded liability was going down and down and down, that's assuming that our unfunded liability does not increase. Is that correct?
That's correct. So that's with the assumption that as of the valuation date, so 2019, the actuaries, they have assumptions in there, and this is assuming that they hit on all of those assumptions. And so if the results are better than their assumptions, then the liability would shrink even more than what was shown this evening. If their if the results are worse than what they've assumed, it would actually add to the liability. So the chart does assume that the actuary hits on the assumptions that they had as of that report date.
Well, if I understood you correctly, then when looking at slide 41, I was surprised when that number for PERS, the remaining amortization, was between 4 years and 29 years, because I thought, how could that be? And then you explained it. It's figured every year on whether it's an actuarial gain or if it's an actuarial loss. So how likely is it that we will always have actuarial losses, and whichever one is going down, loss or gain, going down, I guess you're every year between 2020 and 2039. Is that a reasonable thing, that we will always be on the positive side of going down rather than having a year where we have more, the unfunded liability increases? Did that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think even looking at the discount rate that I'd mentioned as an example, so if PERS, they have that 7% discount rate. And so and we know that in 2020, they only earned 4.7%. And so when the valuation comes for 2020, we know that there's going to be a loss because of that investment, just that part of it, that since they did not meet that 7%, where there's a loss for that. So I would say there's a high probability that we are going to see losses on the valuation report. But for purposes of this presentation, I think we could plug in all types of assumptions, but what we wanted to show this evening is that based off of the most up-to-date information we have, this is how it would kind of play out over time using that valuation. But with each valuation report, depending on how that goes with the losses or gains, that would definitely change this picture.
Right,
Does that
because
answer your
you
question?
say with discount rate, and the 7% means we're going to have increased liabilities and increased contributions, so that would add to it. So, okay.
Correct.
Well, so this basically, we're looking at the best case scenario.
We're looking, if everything held as of the valuation report, this is how it would play out. So yes, if the actuary was 100% right, that's how this would play out.
Okay. And then the other bar graph, I don't know that I wrote down the page exactly which one it was. It showed the PARs and the pension that. So like on the first one, it was about half, 15 out of 32. So that's about half. But I guess is it funded at mostly about 50% or not really?
So currently for PARs, we're at I believe it's 34% as of 2019. So that's where we're at with PARs.
Okay, and then, so tell me, does Measure M affect this bar graph?
Measure M, so just so I'm understanding correctly, does Measure M affect our ability to fund it going forward?
Right, so a lot of the Measure M money going in so that this unfunded liability, so that we're getting 60 cents on the dollar instead of 40 cents on the dollar or whatever he says going up.
Yeah, so right now we're not putting any additional Measure M dollars towards the unfunded liability at all. The only Measure M dollars that would be going towards any sort of unfunded liability would just be related to those employees that are paid out of Measure M. So just for those particular employees, similar to how we do benefit allocations to the rest of the funds, like the general fund, utilities funds, the only payment going to PERS or towards the unfunded liabilities would be specifically related just to the employees funded through Measure M. We haven't taken any Measure M money and made any additional contributions to any of our unfunded liabilities.
Okay, so do you know about how many employees that are funded through Measure M?
Sure, and don't quote me on this because I don't have the exact numbers. I think for the police department, it might be around 9 to 10. I think for the fire department, it's 6. And then I think we have 1 in the city manager's office. But we could definitely circle back and get the accurate numbers on that. But those are the numbers off the top of my head that I recall the positions related to Measure M.
Okay, and my one last question is just for my understanding. On slide 39, you talked about the survivor continuance for police, and then you said it was discontinued. But so is that not anything we need to worry about now, or I just don't know what it is?
Yeah, I apologize if I said that and it was confusing. Basically, when we implemented survivor continuance, which was a contractual obligation with our police union, at the time, what the PERS requirement was that is if you implement it going forward with your active employees, it also is kind of retroactively a benefit to those that have already retired from your agency. So what it did was it resulted in a 15% increase to those that had already retired, and it increased their base pension amount by 15%. So that was something that was part of the implementation of that enhanced benefit. And my reference to that no longer being part of that requirement is just for those agencies in the future that adopt survivor continuance. But unfortunately for us, it impacted our past retirees. So we've
And
already.
they're continuing to get it then, so it wasn't discontinued for them.
Correct. So it's already included in all of our unfunded liability numbers, and we're accounting for it.
And it continues on for the active police now, then it's something that's in the contract. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
benefit available to those employees, but what we didn't realize at the time was the impact it was going to have on prior retirees.
Okay. All right. Well, that explains that then. And those were my questions. Thank you.
Councilmember Silva.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions to my fellow council members, and thanks for answering them. Thanks for the presentation. Just some clarifying questions. I just want to clarify who formed OPEB.
You mean, Councilmember Silva, are you asking?
Sorry, I'm sorry, the advisory board. I apologize.
Oh, who formed the advisory group?
Yeah.
That was, there was applications submitted by the public that was interested and then appointed by the council or the mayor, I believe.
Okay. So I guess just in general, if I'm just kind of curious, and I'm just kind of curious to understand if we as a council implement some type of advisory board and they advise how we follow up on those. But it sounds like that's something that's going to continue to be discussed. I'm also curious to see, maybe it's not appropriate tonight, but just in general, when we have these advisory boards, how do we, how is that communicated out to the public, and kind of what the status is of those recommendations, just so it's kind of transparent and where people kind of feel it's not hanging. So that way they have some type of, I guess, clear understanding of what's going to happen with those efforts and those contributions. So I'll just some comments. My next question is, there was a public comment from one of our citizens regarding suggestions of a third-party auditor. And I apologize if I missed that, if it was kind of addressed or indirectly addressed. Have we had a third-party auditor? And if not, has that been discussed, or are there other ways that there's indirectly a third-party auditor to ensure that there's not any possible conflicts of interest in these evaluations and in these presentations?
Yeah, my understanding was from the email is that it's not an auditor that was being requested. It was a consultant. There's kind of a third party, I think expert is how it was phrased, but it would not be an auditor. So our auditors, they would look at like financial reporting and whether what we're telling you is accurate and what we're reporting in the financial statements is accurate. But my understanding of the email is that it was a request for a third party kind of a consultant.
So I guess then my question is on the auditor.
So your question is, I'm sorry, I didn't.
Do we have some type of third party outside the city audit our projections, our calculations, our budget?
Sure. So we have a third party actuary. So the numbers that we're going off of as far as like, how's OPEB and like the OPEB numbers, the pension numbers, those are going to be based off of numbers provided either by CalPERS and their actuaries, or on the OPEB side, it's numbers that are provided by our actuary Milliman. And so they give us the numbers for where what the liability is. We send them numbers on, for example, how much we put in the OPEB trust, and then we have to send backup to validate that. And then as far as kind of the end-all audit would be when we have our financial reports that are done each year, we put how much we contributed and what the liability is based off of those third-party reports that we get from CalPERS and the actuary Milliman. And so our city auditors, independent city auditors, they would look at our financial statements that we put together and whether they tie to those third-party reports on the unfunded liabilities that we get from CalPERS and the actuary. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, yeah, it does. That's good. Thank you. And then I guess the last question I just have, and I think it was maybe I'm interpreting a little bit differently on Councilmember Wiley's comments. To me, it just seems that the projections for, I think we kept looking at slide 30, for example. So just in general, it just seems to me that that projection would extend out if you have more retirees, or just just to me, it just kind of, I'm just trying to play around with the numbers, and I think I haven't played around with the data yet. I apologize. But I think it would be, to me, it just seems like this would be even extended out even further, just by looking at how the tiers roll out and just kind of rough numbers that have been presented tonight. So I'm just trying to, I guess my question based on that is there like a certain formula that's used to calculate this, or I'm sorry, can you go over this one more time?
Sure. So these numbers and the calculation, they were provided by our actuary. So that's not something that we calculate internally. This is something that we asked our actuary to look at the data that they had used as of the June 19th valuation with our unfunded liability. And then based off of the assumptions that they use to calculate out how this gets amortized over, the next 17 plus years, because that's something that the city had put in place. We had put in place that we were going to amortize our unfunded liability over a closed period. So we weren't going to leave it open. And unlike, kind of what's done with PERS, where every single year, whatever the gain or loss is, that we're amortizing that over like 20 years. This is really a closed period. So it's just 17 years that this gets amortized over. Now, there will be a decision point in the future potentially where, let's say, we do see quite a bit of actuarial losses. The way that our actuary is going to roll that into is they're going to take those losses for every year going forward, and they're going to put it on however many years we have left. So if 5 years from now, if we only have 12 years left, whatever losses we have at that point, they're going to roll that into our contribution in the calculation, with the plan of us paying that off in the remaining 12 years. And if that becomes too much of a burden for the city, then that would be kind of where we would have a discussion with our actuary and potentially looking at what I've seen other cities do is that, they take whatever their unfunded liability is at that time, they continue to amortize it over, that closed period. But anything going forward, any of the new losses, if it becomes too much of a burden, then they kind of set that at its own amortization period, whether that be 10 years or 15 additional years, but they don't take the whole thing. They would just kind of look at, prospectively taking any kind of loss and amortizing out further.
All right. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it.
I see no other council member comments, and things I don't see any other comments. I'm going to wrap it up. I do have basically one comment, and this comment has been something that's bothered me for, I guess, since I've gotten on this council. If you could jump to, I believe it was 39 on your PowerPoint presentation. So, and I understand, and first I should start off by thanking our staff. Our staff has been amazing. Our staff has been incredible through this journey that I've been on the city council. This thing, it wasn't even a deal until it became an issue. And once it became an issue, our staff and our leaders and our city council jumped on it. And unfortunately, people use it for political power, political aspirations. We've had city council members sitting on this city council that are no longer with us, that are very out front and outspoken about how we're not doing enough and we're not trying hard enough. And a lot of people chime in from the city because there's, people that go straight to the paper and write, the sky is falling, we're bankrupting, we're not doing anything. And the people that aren't really paying attention buy into it. And it's been frustrating. And you can tell it's been frustrating for me because we've been working hard and our staff has been working very hard. And our associations that we bargain with have been working very hard. And I don't think anyone gives them that credit. They took huge, huge hits during the recession, and they gave back multiple times. And they're attacked. They're attacked all the time. And I can't thank all the associations enough during those times back in 2009, 2010, 2011, and probably 2012, 13. They continued to give back. They continued to cut their departments. They continued to look for ways to save the city of Vacaville. And if it wasn't for our workers, and if it wasn't for our associations, we would have gone bankrupt. And then people dive in and go to the paper and go to the social media and scream bankruptcy and scream that we don't do anything. It's a little bit of being uneducated. Our staff has done a fantastic job, and I'm going to wrap up with that. But the reason why I wanted you to go to page 39 is it is a little bit disappointing, and I shouldn't say disappointing. On these dates, these are dates that these benefits went into effect. It would be nice to show, and at a later date, obviously you don't have to highlight them tonight, but it would be nice to show that these were negotiated before these dates. These are the dates that went in, and I'm just going to give the example of survivor continuance. It shows 7/11, but that was negotiated years before that. And the police department gave up huge raises that they could have gotten in order to get that. And I know that all of these things are bargained, and they give up lots of other things to get what they asked for. And they have the council, city council. And I go back and I say, city council members that actually authorize these things for these bargaining agreements are the ones that are screaming the loudest that we're horrible and we're not doing a good job. So all I would ask is, if the staff, I don't mind that you put the dates that they went in, but I'd also like the public to understand that those aren't the dates they were negotiated. They were negotiated years before that, and they just slid in 2011 because we were already working on fixing all our issues that we had seen coming. And again, just want to thank staff. Dawn Leonardini, she's been amazing. She has stepped up to the plate and made sure that, the negotiations have went fantastic. She has made sure that we've watched our pennies. And I can't thank everyone enough. And I'm just trying to get the word out there that we have been turning this ship around. And if it wasn't for our associations, none of this would have happened. And if it wasn't for our staff, none of this would happen. And it's just so disappointing that council members use it for their political gangs and for and the people that come out and write about it use it for political gains. And it's sad because nobody knows what's going on. They just see tidbits of what's going on. And we've been doing a fantastic job. And I just appreciate everything that everybody's done. And the ship's coming around. And it's going to continue coming around, and the associations are going to continue working with us. And no one gave them any credit for the third tier. That third tier, no one went and stopped the negotiations. Everyone gave up the benefits, and that was so amazing. And no one heard about it. No one cared about it. No one said anything about it. And I can't thank them enough for coming to the table and giving up something that was huge. Retired medical is huge. So if we can fix that, I would appreciate it. And I want to say thank you to all our council members tonight. Thanks for hanging in there with us. I know it's an extra meeting on top of it, but this one is so important because we need to educate everyone and let everyone know that we're doing a fantastic job. We're turning it around, and we're always looking for ways to save the city money. So with that, I'm going to adjourn tonight. Thank you very much.
I have one question, if possible.
Sure, go ahead.
So my only question is, I did make a comment on this in my question set. We didn't really close the loop on the OPEB Advisory Committee and their recommendations. We basically just delayed it or paused it in October, and we sort of just glossed over it today. Can I ask what the status of that is, or is not? City manager, is that coming back to us? Is that not coming back to us? Can we make a
So,
motion tonight?
I'll answer. I'm going to answer, and then I'm going to tell you if you can motion. First of all, we stopped that committee. We said we were going to let it go. We took their recommendations. We said when the new council came on that we can vote to put a new group together. We put the old group together, and absolutely, obviously, we'll entertain that, but we're not going to entertain that motion tonight. We'll entertain it at an open meeting. Tonight was for informational only. So I would just ask for us to bring that back to, and I would talk to the city manager and see if we can do it, you know, the next meeting. Actually, it's Tuesday, so maybe the following meeting, and bring that back so we can vote on that and see which way the council wants to go. Okay, Vice Mayor?
Yeah, I'll make a motion next council meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone. Good night, Vacaville.